This is the Pioneer CS-63DX, and in the mid-70s, it was Pioneer's top-of-the-line speaker. And that begs the question, 50 years later, do they still sound good? We're going to be chatting about that while we do some updates to them and bring a bit more shine to these beat-up wood cabinets. When I picked them up, neither of the horn tweeters worked. I tried fixing them and was able to fix one, but ended up buying a replacement for the other speaker. I made a video on that repair that's linked at the end of this video and also in the description. In that video, I never actually installed the tweeters into the speakers and listened to them, so I'm looking forward to hearing how they sound in this video. But the cabinets are in really rough shape, so I got to work prettying them up. I started by sanding with 150 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander and a sanding block to remove as many scratches as I could. The veneer on these is pretty thick, and even on these bad scratches and watermarks on the top, I was mostly able to remove them. With this in mind, I was still doing my best to not sand through the veneer until... Did you see it? It just happens so fast. I guess I have to learn how to fix it. But first, one speaker previously had 2 of these super tweeters replaced, and whomever did it decided to remove 2 of the threaded inserts that they mount on. The holes leak air and just make an unpleasant whistling, so I filled them with a black silicone. To prep the wood for stain, I wiped it with isopropyl alcohol. You don't want to have any sawdust or oils from your fingers on the wood. Howard's Restore finish isn't meant to be used as a standalone stain, but it works great for blending color differences if you remove only parts of an old finish, so it worked marvelously on these speakers. I used the golden oak color and applied it with Quad Zero steel wool, but if I'd used a darker one, it might have blended the hole in the veneer a bit better, so I'll touch that up later on. I'm really happy with how the wood is turning out, especially compared with what it looked like before. Alright, so while that last layer of stain dries, I wanted to clean up these grills. Now these grills are actually real wood, and they have the same sort of splotchiness you can kind of see on them just in various spots from water being dripped on them and such over age. So I wanted to put a little bit of Howard's on these, but they're very dusty. So I brought with me a little brush. We're gonna just clean these up and vacuum them out here real quick. As much as I love these grills, when I first saw the speakers with them removed, I really loved the way that they looked. Something about the black front baffle and layout of the drivers is really pleasing to look at, and I thought they could even look good hanging in a cafe or other space, but I don't have a spot for them at the moment. After 15 minutes or so, I wiped off the excess Restore finish and let them dry for an hour. Let's play a quick round of how did this happen with vintage hi-fi. So this grill is supposed to go on and kind of sit flush. You can see it's over here, but it doesn't sit flush over here. There's something in the way. And if we take a look, there's a row of staples along the bottom here, and one of them just is not in all the way for whatever reason. And I just have to wonder how long was that a manufacturing thing that's there, and this grill has never even been on all the way, or did somebody put the staples in later? Who knows? But we are gonna see if we can either hit it in all the way or just pull it out. Look at that. Right in. No problem. And now, the grill goes in all the way. I'm a big fan of Howard's Feed and Wax for a quick and easy wax and oil coat to seal up the wood. Applying a coat and letting it sit for around 30 minutes before wiping off the excess adds a nice shine to stained wood surfaces and ups the contrast. It's a shame that the hole in the veneer sure is obvious. I'm super excited to have these home and looking as good as they can, because I haven't compared any speakers to my Tannoy monitor golds that I used regularly in a really long time. So I'm really actually just super curious to hear how these sound, especially now with the tweeters, and I'm really curious to see if that bass response is as bad as I remember it being when I first picked these up. Baby, you give me midnight. You whip up my appetite. Don't leave me high and dry. Baby, you give me ice and fire. Which one sounded better to you? A or B? A was the Tannoys and B was the Pioneers. It's not the most fair comparison since the Tannoys are in slightly better listening position and the Pioneers are 3 decibels more efficient, but after listening to a few of my go-to songs, the Pioneers still sounded just muddy and have that early 70s boxy sound to them. I prefer the crystal clear studio monitor sound of the Tannoys. Increasing the mid and high levels with the knobs on the back did help brighten them up, but didn't fix them entirely. As far as the bass response, the Tannoys definitely go lower and have more bass energy under 45 Hz. What I'm hoping is that when we recap them, the normal function is going to sound about the same as the increased function. I placed an order for the new capacitors, but one of them was sent to back order, so it's a few weeks later and I've got all the components here. I also put a parts list for the crossover in the description, complete with most of the resistor values. Alright, so I had previously pulled all these resistors off of this board to see if we could figure out the values on them, because some of the values are on the bottom. Unfortunately, the glue that's on here, when you peel it off, it also peels off the value, and so I wasn't able to get all the values for the resistors, but I got a lot of them, and I was able to test them, and they all tested fine. They usually won't go bad, and these are also hollow on the inside. Typically that means they're a 20-watt resistor, so to replace these would actually end up being kind of expensive, because you'd have to get, they're also a double, and if you wanted to replace them, the only option would be to get 8 20-watt resistors, which would end up being pretty expensive. So on these, we're just going to be replacing these 4 silver capacitors here. But first, I'm just going to go ahead and hot glue these back to this board. I used my solder vacuum to remove the solder on the post. Then I cut the lead on each side of the capacitor so that I could heat up any remaining solder and use pliers to remove the leads from the post. There's a 0.5 microfarad capacitor kind of hiding behind this inductor here that they don't really make 0.5 microfarad. So I got a 0.47 microfarad capacitor, and then I just paralleled a 0.01, so it makes it a 0.48 capacitor overall, which is well within the 20% tolerance of the capacitors that are in here, and these capacitors have a 5% tolerance, so we're doing great. And then these are for the woofer, so there's a 14 microfarad capacitor up here for the woofer, and the reason that these are electrolytic and these are film is because for the woofer, the 14 microfarad would not only be really big and more expensive than these, $3 electrolytics or less, but the woofer is basically a low pass filter. So it cuts all the high frequencies out of the woofer channel, and you don't need to use film capacitors because basically film capacitors have less resistance at higher frequencies than electrolytics do, which is why when you replace them in a crossover, it tends to make the speaker sound more bright. And so it doesn't really make sense to use them in a woofer. And realistically, we probably don't even need to replace this 14 microfarad, but since we're in here, we're just gonna go ahead and do it anyways. To install the new capacitor, I wrapped the leads around both posts, then cut off any excess wire. I also reused the insulator on the left side lead from the old capacitor. I then used pliers to crimp down the leads around the post and applied a liberal amount of solder until the leads were fully submersed. You never want to use only solder to hold a capacitor in place, as it can crack or come loose from the speaker vibrations. Alrighty, so I finished putting these capacitors in. The only thing left to do is add some hot glue, and I tested, and the 3.3 and the 14 are within spec. They're below the 20% tolerance they should be at, but this one is about 18% out, so it's very close to that. While the 0.5 microfarad and the 7 are right at 20 or 21% tolerance, which is that's not great. Before we test them with the new caps, I noticed that a few of these black metal clips that hold the lattice together are missing, loose, or one is corroded. I have some extras from a set of CS-68 speakers that I parted out, and they're the same style across most of the CS line of speakers with grills like these, but the later line, including the 63DX, used slightly wider clips, so I had to use some pliers to flatten out the edges, but they worked fine. I cleaned the corroded one with a Q-tip and rubbing alcohol, then a green scrub pad, and a final cleaning with alcohol before using a Sharpie to color it black. Since these are a low wear item, the Sharpie is more than durable enough, and the color is a perfect match. I only recapped one speaker, so first we'll compare them against each other, then I'll recap the other speaker and we'll compare them against the Tannoys again. I'll play one speaker at a time in mono and use the balance knob to alternate between them. Baby, you give me midnight. You whip up my appetite. Don't leave me here high and dry. Oh, I don't wanna jinx it, baby. The one on the left is the recapped one, and as you can hear, it sounds significantly louder. It's also much less muddy and boxy sounding. This was both speakers playing on the normal setting, and the recapped one is a bit brighter than it was on the increased setting previously, which is great. Off camera, I went ahead and recapped the second speaker, and this is them compared to the Tannoys. After the recap, these definitely sound better. They just sound less boxy and muffled, and I actually really like the way that they sound. And if they were the only set of speakers that I had, and I listened to mostly jazz or folk or rock, stuff that just didn't have a ton of bass in it, then I would be super happy with these. However, when I do switch back to the Tannoys, I still like them more. They just sound a bit clearer, and that extra bit of bass that they have does make a big difference. So if I was to keep these, I'd probably pair them with a subwoofer just to fill in that low end, but even then, the high end is just not as good as what I would expect from the Tannoys. My friend David came over and gave them a listen, and he pointed out that with the vocal harmonies in one of my favorite songs, you could barely tell that there were multiple people singing on the Pioneers. Everything sort of gets mushed together, whereas the Tannoys do a better job of separating and emphasizing each instrument and vocal. I still really love the way these look, and I'm happy that I could restore them to a better condition and give them a second life. I'm fairly happy with that veneer repair, but I'm sure I'll get better as time goes on. It's an art in and of itself. Thanks so much for watching.